August 12, 2014. Lauren Bacall is dying of a stroke inside her apartment at the Dakota, the same building she moved into the year her first husband died, 57 years earlier. She built an entire family inside these rooms. She is the only person who ever understood what that actually cost. 3 children carry pieces of that cost. Stephen Bogart, Leslie Bogart, Sam Robards. 2 surnames, 1 mother, 3 separate lives quietly assembled out of a childhood she never let the cameras see in full. For 60 years, the world watched Lauren Bacall as Bogey's girl, the voice, the look, the legend everyone still quotes. Almost no one watched what her 3 children were absorbing behind that image: a father dead when the oldest was 7, a stepfather's addiction by the time the youngest was 9, a mother running 3 lives on wool and work alone. This is not the highlight reel, and it is not the tabloid version either. This is what was actually happening to Lauren Bacall and to her 3 children at the exact same time across 60 years. Most retrospectives compress into a single sentence about Bogie and Bacall. Before there were 3 children, there was one abandoned one. She was born Betty Joan Persk in the Bronx in 1924, an only child. Her parents divorced when she was 6. Her father disappeared from her life almost entirely by the time she was 8, unreachable, unsupporting. She was raised by her mother and widowed grandmother, on a secretary's salary, in an apartment with no man in it. She later said, plainly, that growing up watching her mother carry the whole household alone had shaped her own instinct never to fully trust that a man would stay. Her mother eventually remarried a man named Lee Goldberg and relocated to California only after her daughter had already become a star, meaning that even the one parent who stayed had, in her own way, built her later life around Bacall's success rather than the other way around. That instinct would prove almost prophetic. But first came the accident of stardom. She graduated high school at 15, modeled for department stores, was crowned Miss Greenwich Village in 1942, and landed on the cover of Harper's Bazaar in 1943, a photograph that reached the wife of director Howard Hawks, who brought Bacall in for a screen test. Hawks told the 19-year-old he intended to pair her, in her first film, with either Cary Grant or an actor she considered unremarkable at the time, Humphrey Bogart, 25 years her senior. She got Bogart. On the set of To Have and Have Not, an affair began. Bogart was still married to his 3rd wife, and it survived the scandal that followed. On May 21, 1945, on a farm in Ohio owned by a novelist friend, Bacall married Bogart. She was 20. He was 45. Before either child was born, the marriage was already being tested by something bigger than either of them could control. In October 1947, less than 2.5 years into the marriage, Bacall and Bogart flew to Washington as the most famous faces in the Committee for the First Amendment, a group of Hollywood liberals. Bacall reportedly pushed her new husband toward founding it, who chartered a plane to sit in on the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings and defend colleagues accused of communist sympathies. Crowds turned out in city after city specifically to see them. Under studio pressure that followed, the Bogarts publicly walked the stance back within weeks, a retreat Bacall herself later called, in her own memoir, a question of whether the trip had helped anyone at all. It was an early, private preview of a pattern that would define the rest of her life: conviction, exposure, cost, and the discipline to keep functioning afterward regardless. For the next 12 years, her life was built almost entirely around the marriage that survived all of it. Stephen Humphrey Bogart was born January 6, 1949, named for the character, Steve, that had first brought his parents together on screen. Leslie Howard Bogart followed on August 23, 1952, named for the actor whose insistence on casting Bogart in an earlier film had helped launch his career. 2 children, 2 quiet acts of gratitude toward 2 different men, both born into a Holmby Hills household with Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra as neighbors and regular guests. Bacall stepped back from her own career almost entirely during these years, partly because Bogart, 3 times divorced already, asked her to, believing a career and a marriage couldn't survive together. She agreed. Decades later, writing her memoirs, she said that whenever she thought of the word happy now, she thought of exactly this stretch of her life: small children, a famous husband, a home that simply worked. Stephen would later describe a childhood that felt, for a while, almost ordinary underneath all the fame. In a 1995 interview, he recalled simply playing with other famous kids in the neighborhood: the lyricist Sammy Kahn's son, the broadcaster Art Linkletter's daughter, the way any child plays with the children of his parents' friends. That ordinariness was the entire point. None of the four of them yet knew it wasn't going to last. But even inside those closest years, the marriage carried more strain than the family photographs ever showed. During the 1952 Adlai Stevenson presidential campaign, Bacall, a committed liberal Democrat since marching alongside Bogart against the Hollywood blacklist and the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, became so absorbed in Stevenson's candidacy that she later described the feeling as close to worship. She campaigned at his side across the country while Stephen and Leslie were toddlers at home. Bogart, by his own private notes to friends, grew visibly uneasy watching his wife's attention pulled somewhere he couldn't follow. The infatuation cooled once Stevenson lost that November. It's a small, mostly forgotten footnote now, but a reminder that even the closest period of this family's history was never quite as simple as the photographs suggest. In 1956, Bogart was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. Even as he underwent surgery and grew visibly weaker across the following months, Bacall kept working. She filmed Designing Woman opposite Gregory Peck during this same stretch, a comedy released in May 1957, 4 months after her husband's death, shot while she was, in effect, watching him die in slow motion between takes. Bogart died at home on January 14, 1957. Stephen was 7 years old. Leslie was 4. This is the closest the four of them would ever be as a single unit, not because something later broke it on purpose, but because everything that came after had to be rebuilt around a hole none of them had chosen and none of them could fill. A pause before the second period begins. I want to be careful here, because a script like this usually reaches for a tragedy that didn't actually happen. Bacall did not vanish into her grief. She did not hand her children to someone else to raise. What she lost, at 32, was the entire architecture of the life she had spent 12 years building, and what replaced it is harder to romanticize but far more honest: a widow, alone, trying to work out who she was without Bogey's wife attached to her name, with 2 small children watching her figure it out in real time, in front of a press corps that never once stopped watching either. Bacall moved Stephen and Leslie out of the Holmby Hills house that held every memory of their father and into New York City, Bogart's native city, an apartment inside the Dakota, a fresh start she chose deliberately rather than one that was chosen for her. The children were enrolled at the American School in New York. A surviving photograph from January 1959 shows Bacall collecting them from school in the plainest way imaginable: no premiere, no magazine shoot, just a mother at the gate. For 2 children who had just lost their father, that ordinary detail carried more weight than anything glamorous ever could. The most important thing happening in their lives that year was that she kept showing up. At the same time, a very different kind of distance was opening, not between Bacall and her children, but between the private widow and the public spectacle being made of her grief. During Bogart's final illness, she had leaned increasingly on the company of Frank Sinatra, a close family friend from their shared social circle, the so-called Holmby Hills Rat Pack, the same loose fraternity of stars, including Sinatra himself, who had once flown to Washington a decade earlier standing beside the Bogarts against the blacklist. He was already, by 1957, one of the few people outside the marriage who had watched the whole 12 years up close. Within roughly a year of Bogart's death, that friendship turned into a romance she later described as combustible, adoring one day, unreachable the next. In 1958, a restaurant table, Sinatra handed her a napkin and a pen and asked her to sign her new name. She said yes to the proposal. She was, by her own account, ecstatic. The engagement lasted only as long as it stayed private. Once the news leaked, through her own agent, to gossip columnist Lauren Parsons without Bacall's knowledge, Sinatra reacted by cutting off contact almost entirely, convinced she had leaked it herself. Bacall later wrote that she had no idea the phone call in which he told her they'd need to lay low would be the last call she'd ever get from him. She next saw him at a mutual friend's dinner party, seated one person away. He did not speak to her. He did not, in her own account, seem to see her at all. She called it one of the more humiliating moments of her life, and, years later, came to believe that Sinatra had done her an enormous favor by ending it before it became a marriage. That humiliation played out entirely in the columns her children were too young to read, but not too young to feel the aftershock of, in a mother who came home from it changed. Stephen was 9. Leslie was 6. Neither of them read Lauren Parsons. Nearly everyone else in America did. In 1960, still recovering from the Sinatra collapse, Bacall began seeing actor Sam Robards, fresh off his Broadway triumph as James Tyrone Jr. in Long Day's Journey into Night, a Navy veteran who had witnessed the aftermath of Pearl Harbor as a young radioman before turning to acting. They tried to marry in Vienna in June 1961 and were turned away by Austrian authorities over paperwork neither of them could produce. A second attempt in Las Vegas failed for the identical reason. They finally married in Ensenada, Mexico, on July 4, 1961. 6 months later, on December 16, 1961, Sam Robards was born in New York. Stephen was 12. Leslie was 9. For the first time, the household held a new father, a new half-brother, and 2 older children who now had to make room for both. What the record shows plainly, and what Bacall herself confirmed without softening it in her own memoirs, is that the marriage was unhappy almost from the start. Robards was already, by his own later accounts, wrestling with depression rooted in his own parents' divorce when he was 5 years old, a childhood echo of the same fractured household patterns Sam would now inherit from him. Robards' own father had been a successful silent film actor whose career collapsed with the arrival of sound, a decline the young Robards watched firsthand and that reportedly soured him on Hollywood for years before he ever set foot in front of a camera himself. He carried both the depression and the alcoholism that would define his 1960s into the marriage with Bacall. Bacall called the marriage a simple mismatch, nothing more dramatic than that. The household Sam Robards was born into was one his own mother later described, in a different context, as combustible, and in this marriage, that combustion had no happy resolution waiting on the other side of it. The couple divorced in 1969. Sam was 7. The court granted Bacall full custody, which meant Sam's early childhood ran on his mother's professional schedule rather than a settled routine: Broadway matinees, evening performances, nights spent in dressing rooms because there was nowhere else for him to be. He was taken backstage after performances of applause before he was old enough to fully understand what he was watching his mother build out of the wreckage of 2 failed marriages. In the early 1970s, mother and son lived for a period in London while she worked, and Sam attended the American school there, an entirely different childhood geography than the one his older half-siblings had grown up inside. No Holmby Hills mansion, no famous next-door neighbors, just a single mother and a young son moving between 2 countries because that's where the work happened to be. By his own account, being taken backstage as a boy and seeing the scale of a Broadway house from the wings was where he first began imagining what it might feel like to be applauded for something of his own, years before he ever set foot in an acting class. Stephen and Leslie, 16 and 13 when the Robards' divorce finalized, had now watched their mother end 2 marriages within a single decade, one to death, one to addiction. 3 children. One household rebuilt twice. 2 absent fathers arrived at by 2 entirely different roads, and a mother whose income, through all of it, came almost entirely from her own capacity to keep working. Television guest spots, film cameos and ensemble pictures, and the beginning of a stage run that would earn her a Tony Award for applause in 1970 and a second, 11 years later, for Woman of the Year. both arriving directly out of the stretch of her career when Hollywood had largely gone quiet on her and Broadway hadn't. If you've made it this far, this is the part of Lauren Bacall's story most telling. Skip entirely, because it isn't the glamorous half. What happens to these three children over the following 3 decades? The half-brother who barely knew his older sibling's childhood, the son who inherited a movie star's addiction along with his name, the daughter who chose to disappear from the frame on purpose, is the part almost nobody has put together in one place before. Stay for it, and subscribe if you want the rest of this family's actual record, not the version on the trading cards. A second pause. Here is what the framing of distance gets wrong about this period, and I'd rather hold it honestly than force a shape onto it that isn't true. Sam Robards was not shipped away from his mother's hardship. He lived inside it, night after night, in dressing rooms and back seats of cars between cities, at an age when most children are learning to read. Leslie, for her part, has said she remembers small, ordinary things from these same years: errands, shopping trips, quiet afternoons, not because nothing difficult was happening around her, but because a mother trying to hold 3 lives together does most of that holding in exactly the unremarkable moments nobody ever photographs. And Stephen, the oldest, was old enough by 1969 to understand precisely what a second marriage ending looked like from the inside, which meant that whatever it later took for him to spend decades of his adult life writing calmly about his own father, he had already survived watching his mother lose a second man to a very different kind of destruction first. By the late 1970s, all 3 children were adults, and something in the family had become permanent, not a rupture, a shape. Stephen became a writer and producer, eventually building an entire second career out of trying to reconstruct his father through his mother's memory. He wrote 3 books: Bogart, In Search of My Father, Play It Again, and The Remake, As Time Goes By, and produced television documentaries, including a 1997 project marking the 40th anniversary of his father's death, that turned his own inherited grief into a public archive. He married twice. First to Dale Irene Gemelli, from 1969 to 1984, with whom he had a child. Later to Barbara Bruchman, from 1985 to 2010. Through those marriages, Bacall and Bogart's line produced 3 grandchildren: Richard, James, and a daughter, Brooke, the only granddaughter Bacall and Bogart ever had. Brooke briefly pursued a modeling career in her late teens in the 2000s, drawing press attention purely for the family name attached to her, before choosing a quieter adult life. She later married Mike Audette and had 2 children of her own, meaning Bacall, before her death, had lived long enough to become a great-grandmother through the son who had lost his father at 7 years old. Leslie trained as a registered nurse in the 1970s, working for years alongside a physical therapist before she found her real calling. She began practicing yoga in 1982 and received her first teaching certification in 1985, eventually immersing herself in the teachings of Krishnamacharya and Dizikachar under teacher Gary Kraftso and completing his yoga therapist's training course, trading the family's decades of stage lights and film premieres for a discipline built almost entirely around stillness. She built a life almost entirely outside the industry that had defined her childhood: private, soft-spoken, rarely photographed by her own clear choice. She married yoga teacher and author Erich Skiffman in 1990, and yet she never fully disappeared from the family record. She is visible beside her mother and brother at the 1997 Bogart stamp unveiling, at the 2009 Governor's Awards, in decades of family photographs that show a daughter who chose privacy without choosing distance. Sam became an actor, moving directly into the profession that had shaped both his parents and his stepfather in all but name. He landed his first film role in Paul Mazursky's Tempest in 1982, appeared in Fandango and Bright Lights, Big City through the decade, and spent the 1990s building steadily through television. Spencer, for Hire, a lead role in the series TV 101, des turns that widened as the years went on. He married actress Susie Amis in 1986. They divorced in 1994. He married Sidsel Jensen in 1997 and remained married to her for decades after. His career eventually reached its peak visibility in Steven Spielberg's AI. Artificial Intelligence in 2001, followed by recurring roles on The West Wing, Sex and the City, and Blue Bloods. Meanwhile, Jason Robards had married a fourth time in 1970 to Lois O'Connor, finally achieving the sobriety that had eluded him throughout his years with Bacall, though not before a near-fatal, alcohol-related car crash in 1972 nearly ended his life. Sober, he went on to win back-to-back Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor, as Ben Bradley in All the President's Men and as Dashiell Hammett in Julia, a version of Professional Triumph. His own son with Bacall largely watched from a distance, since the two households rarely intersected after 1969. Robards had two more children with O'Connor, Shannon and Jake, giving Sam two half-siblings on his father's side to go with the two he already had on his mother's. Robards died of lung cancer in December 2000 at 78. Sam was 39. Through all of it, Bacall herself never stopped working. She returned to Broadway in Cactus Flower in 1965, then won her first Tony for Applause in 1970, a musical adaptation of All About Eve, the film that had starred her childhood idol, Bette Davis. After a performance, Davis came backstage and told her, simply, that she was the only one who could have played the part. Bacall would go on to win the Sarah Siddons Award, an honor inspired by that same film, twice, in 1972 and again in 1984, and returned to Broadway once more in 1981 in Woman of the Year, earning a second Tony and a mixed but respectful review from the New York Times' Frank Rich. Off stage, her political convictions never slowed either. She campaigned for Robert F. Kennedy's Senate run in 1964, sat on the Hollywood committee that backed his 1968 presidential campaign, and remained, by her own description late in life, unapologetically and permanently a liberal. The family kept appearing together in public, decade after decade, in a pattern too consistent to be accidental. 1982, Bacall with Leslie, Sam, and Stephen, all four in frame at the Tempest premiere party. 1997, Leslie and Stephen flanking their mother at the Hollywood unveiling of Humphrey Bogart's postage stamp. 2009, all three seated together at the Governor's Awards, watching her finally receive the honorary Oscar the Academy had spent 50 years withholding competitively. A nomination for The Mirror Has Two Faces in 1997, opposite Barbra Streisand, who had personally chosen Bacall for the role, having come the closest of her career to the statuette itself, and losing anyway. Asked to summarize her own luck in a 1996 television interview, Bacall needed only one sentence. She had had one great marriage, 3 great children, and 4 grandchildren. If there is a real place to sit with all of this before the story closes, it's here, because it complicates the entire premise a documentary like this usually runs on. The tragedy in Lauren Bacall's family was never that her children drifted out of reach. It's that closeness and cost were never separate things for any of them. Staying near her meant staying near everything she was still carrying from 1957 and from 1969. None of the 3 chose to leave. What became permanent in this period was simply the terms under which all 4 of them agreed to keep standing near one another. A third pause, the longest one. There is a version of this family's story a lazier documentary would tell: mother destroyed, children scattered, distance widening until nothing is left. It would fit a 5-act tragedy far more neatly. It would also be false. What actually happened is stranger, and harder to sit with. A woman who kept every one of her children within arm's reach for 6 decades, and 3 adults who kept choosing to stay there, even though staying meant absorbing everything she never fully put down herself. I keep coming back to the fact that none of the 3 ever wrote a public account describing their mother as absent. Stephen wrote 3 books trying to understand his father through her, which is its own kind of closeness. Leslie built a private life, but never a distant one. She is in the photographs, decade after decade, right up until the end. Sam carried a childhood built on dressing rooms and still ended up in the same industry as both his parents, by choice, as an adult. If this family has a secret at all, it isn't the one this kind of story usually promises. It's simply that surviving Lauren Bacall's version of motherhood required inheriting her exact brand of endurance, and all three of them did. By her final years, Bacall was one of the last living stars of Hollywood's golden age, named the 20th greatest female star of classic Hollywood cinema by the American Film Institute, the recipient of the Cecil B. DeMille Award for Career Achievement in 1992 and the Katharine Hepburn Medal from Bryn Mawr College in 2006, and in June 2007, the speaker delivering a memorial address for her old friend, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. at London's Reform Club, one of the last surviving links to an entire vanished social circle of Hollywood liberals, blacklist fighters, and Kennedy-era idealists that had shaped her politics since 1947. She had also been married, at different points in her life, to one Academy Award winner and one who would eventually win two, and had herself finally collected an Academy Honorary Award of her own in 2009. She had outlived Bogart by 57 years and Robards by 14. And she simply never stopped working. In her late 70s and 80s, in defiance of an industry that usually stops writing parts for women that age, she took roles in Lars von Trier's Dogville in 2003 and Jonathan Glazer's Birth in 2004, voiced the Witch of the Waste in the English dub of Hayao Miyazaki's Howl's Moving Castle that same year, and finished a role in The Forger in 2009 at 85. In November 2013, at 89, she was still expressing interest in a new film project, Trouble Is My Business. That same month she joined the voice cast of the animated Ernest and Celestine. Her very last performance, a guest voice appearance in a Family Guy episode titled Mom's the Word, was recorded and aired in the same year she died, a woman who kept showing up for the work until there was, quite literally, no time left to show up for anything else. On August 12, 2014, at 89 years old, she suffered a stroke inside that same Dakota apartment, the one she had moved into as a 32-year-old widow, 57 years earlier, trying to build a life out of what was left of the first one. She was taken to New York Presbyterian Hospital, where she was pronounced dead. She was 5 weeks short of her 90th birthday. At that exact hour, her 3 children were living out 3 separate adult versions of the same 12 founding years. Stephen, 65, was still overseeing his father's estate and its annual film festival in Key Largo, still the family's self-appointed archivist, still writing and producing the story of a household he had spent 5 decades trying to explain to strangers who only ever wanted to talk about his parents' 4 films together. Leslie, 61, was teaching yoga, married since 1990 to Erich Skiffman, living the deliberately private life she had built specifically to stay reachable by family and unreachable by anyone else's camera. Sam, 52, was working as an actor, carrying a surname that belonged to neither of his siblings and a childhood that had run on a completely different clock than theirs. Dressing rooms instead of a settled house, a father who won 2 Oscars he barely got to watch him win them for. None of the 3 were in the room when it happened. All 3 were, in every way that actually mattered, still standing inside the life she had spent 57 years constructing around the 4 of them, a life that had survived a cancer diagnosis, a broken engagement conducted in the pages of national newspapers, an alcoholic second marriage, 2 divorces from death and from a courtroom, and every single ordinary Tuesday in between that nobody thought to document at all. She was interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, a return, in death, to the coast she'd left in 1957. Her estate, an estimated $26.6 million, built across 7 decades of film, television, and stage work, passed entirely to her children. Not a settlement for a lifetime of absence. An inheritance from a mother who, whatever else was true of her, never once actually let go. August 12, 2014. The Dakota. The same rooms she moved into in 1957, the year everything first had to be rebuilt from nothing. The first time we described this moment, it looked like an ending arriving in isolation, one woman, alone, in an apartment, at the end of a long life. It reads differently now. Stephen Bogart, Leslie Bogart, and Sam Robards were not absent because they hadn't tried. They were three adults who had spent 60 years being exactly as close to their mother as she would allow anyone in her life to get, closer, in fact, than almost anyone else ever managed. The secret fate of Lauren Bacall's three children was never disappearance, and it was never distance. It was this: three people who inherited both her strength and everything she never fully processed herself, who kept showing up at premieres and stamp unveilings and award shows for 6 decades straight, who buried two fathers between the three of them and never once, publicly, buried the relationship with the one parent who outlasted every version of the family she had tried, and largely managed, to build. What running that close to her, for that long, finally produced was not a tragedy. It was three adults who became, each in their own separate way, exactly as resilient as the woman who raised them. There is no scene in this story where any of the four of them walk away from each other. Not in 1957, when the first husband died. Not in 1961, when a second husband arrived carrying his own quiet ruin along with him, 6 months before their son was even born. Not in 1969, when that second marriage ended in a divorce court. Not in 2014, in a bedroom at the Dakota, 57 years after she first carried two grieving children through that building's front door and decided, on her own, that she was going to make it work. She did. That is the whole secret. There was never a hidden estrangement to uncover, no lost decade to reveal, no dramatic falling out waiting at the bottom of this story the way the title promised. The real, quietly extraordinary fact, the fate this family actually met, is that Lauren Bacall's three children simply never left. And neither, in the end, did she.